This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, Prashant, I want to get right to this question of your perspective on the U.S. resilience, the resilience of the United States, particularly during this really challenging time with the pandemic, also with this maybe awakening to the racial injustice that's been with this country since the very beginning of the formation of the country. And as someone who's lived all over the world, who currently is, of course, living in Tennessee, I would love for you to share with listeners your perspective and thoughts on America's resilience and, from your viewpoint.
Mark, thank you for the opportunity. From my perspective, I do see America as being an exceptional society and the greatest multicultural society in human history. And part of it goes to the founding of America and the founding principles of America and what it means to be an American. And this country and this society is one of the very few in the world, if not the only one, where what mattered was understanding and adhering to a set of principles of what made it great and what it meant to be an American, which meant belief in the freedom of speech, the various amendments, the privileging of the individual over a monarchy or a state, and most importantly, upward mobility and the chance for people to succeed. Having lived in quite a few countries, including most recently in the last couple of years, I am a huge optimist and celebrate this concept of America. And I think it will continue to remain, as both Presidents Kennedy and Reagan called it multiple times, the shining city on the hill. What makes me so optimistic about America?
Exactly.
Well, I think
Thank you
it
for
goes back to fundamentals.
that.
It goes back to the fundamentals of what makes America this great society. It's the whole idea of looking forward, of ignoring history, and what I would say almost this tendency to have a very short term, long term memory, which leads to a high tolerance for failure. It's the land of second, third, fourth, and more chances. It's a place where you're not burdened by what has happened in previous generations, which can have certain consequences, but from an individual perspective and from a society perspective, it allows us to acknowledge history, but at the same time, do things differently, even if the same thing may have been tried 50 or 100 years ago, or even 15 years ago and not worked. It is one of still the greatest societies that allows an individual to reinvent herself or himself and do that with the ability to associate freely with other individuals who believe in that. And it's certainly a society where risk taking is not only encouraged, but is also celebrated. And as a result of these foundational principles, I continue to be optimistic for America and for my children who are 8 and 3. And I am completely confident that this will continue to be a greater society when they are at the same age that I am.
I just love that optimism and how you've expressed it. And, also, of course, the basis for that, your sentiments. I mean, the experience that you've had in living and working all over the world, and still being convinced, even comparing what's going on here with these other major countries and feeling that level of optimism. So thank you very much for sharing that. I think a lot of us need that right now, that kind of feeling of, this too shall pass, and that we're going to, tomorrow is going to be better than today. And, I want to also mention that what's fascinating about your professional background is, as an engineer, but also as someone who is a gifted communicator. I mean, you've written many books. You have another book coming out. I think it would be a good idea to consider writing the next Democracy in America kind of book, similar to the original, obviously, in the sense of perspective. But I would really appreciate you sharing with the audience, how you have become such a skilled communicator, even though, your academic training was, quite technical and quantitative in nature.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for those kind words. To jump into the question that you asked, with my degrees in engineering and linguistics, I think I was blessed in the fact that I had a chance to exercise both sides of my brain.
Mm-hmm.
And it really goes back to communication, writing, and speech being the foundation of my ability to express technical ideas. Most of my books have the theme of demystifying. It's about taking technology concepts and making them accessible to people who are not technical,
Mm-hmm.
people who do not want to be technical, people who come with the arts and humanities background. Because in the technological age we live in, if we are not able to do that, then we truly can't get to the holy grail of where we want to, which is the true democratization of technology that supports the democratization of society. The digital divide certainly exists. And in order for the digital divide to reduce, we should be able to communicate science and technology in ways that are accessible to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
How did that come about? I owe a lot of it to my mom. My father, like me, was a chemical engineer, a chemist of pretty national renown back in India.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother, on the other hand, is an economist and a social worker.
Mm-hmm.
And she inculcated in me, she took this kid who was an introvert, who was absolutely scared of audiences, and taught me to love reading,
Mm-hmm.
taught me how to go on stage and speak before people, how to develop that confidence, the ability to deliver an idea, a concept, share it with passion and enthusiasm, even as you have butterflies in your stomach,
Sure.
which I will admit as a natural introvert still hasn't completely gone away for me,
Mm-hmm.
even with the number of interviews I have done and the number of talks I've given from stage. So it goes back really to my those foundational upbringing and the lessons that my mom taught me. The love of reading led to exploring ideas, sitting in a place where I couldn't really travel across the globe and see all these wonderful things, but I had them come to my chair even as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And that background, I think, was the one that got me started.
Mm-hmm.
The love of reading also led me to, again, one of, I would say, the most influential writers on science in human history, Carl Sagan.
Mm-hmm.
And Carl Sagan, in his classical book, my favorite, um, and he's got many, was Broca's Brain. And in Broca's Brain, he talks about this polymath and the surgeon and neurologist and a cultural anthropologist called Paul Broca.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul Broca essentially was the first person to talk about how certain parts of the brain led to certain characteristics, connecting the physiological characteristics to the characteristics we exhibited as human beings. And that book that I read while in school also changed my perspective and taught me that you can't separate science and communication.
Mhm.
Mere quantification, mathematics, physics, and chemistry doesn't necessarily lead to understanding.
Mm.
Communicating this across multiple audience skills, audience expectations, the ability to weave a story and deliver that story successfully is what leads to a common shared understanding of science, a love of science, and a healthier society where both scientists and non scientists can understand each other and thrive.
Just so beautifully, beautifully laid out, Prashant. And I want to ask you, for those listening who are interested and do strive to improve communication, what recommendations, what advice do you have for them? Clearly, as a young boy, you're starting to do this and you're doing more and more, and you practiced, I'm sure, and you had more opportunities, and over time, you became the master communicator that you are. What if I'm a listener and I'm, maybe working in a lab or industry, or I'm a mechanical chemical engineer, or, but I'm interested in working on my communication skills. What advice do you have for people in that position?
I would say, Mark, the first thing is to even go back to the basics. Go back to the basics and understand what science is. As Sagan writes, science is really not as much a body of knowledge or a set of skills as much as it is a way of thinking.
Hmm.
We practice science sometimes for the sake of science, but more importantly, to understand both how we behave as individuals and how the world behaves around us. And that perception, that understanding of what science is, which in my opinion is really a kind of ecstasy,
Hmm.
drives what we want to do with that science. The contract that we have in the scientific or a science driven world we live in today is very different from the world as it existed, say, 1,000 years ago, where, or even 500 years ago, when scientists were punished for trying to look into things that weren't understood.
Mm.
There was almost a Faustian bargain, so to speak, of we will leave you alone or we will let you practice science as long as you don't look into things that we are not supposed to understand, quote unquote.
Right.
And what that has resulted today is a world in which scientists and engineers and others in the technology realm
Mhm.
have much more of a free hand in breaking science down, in practicing science with a lot more freedom. But the social contract that is implicit and explicit in that world we live in today is that we are able to explain that science as much as we can.
Mm.
We are able to make that science accessible to people who are not just in the ivory tower, but who are able to come down and who are able to deliver the message, sometimes by coming down the staircase, in other cases by bringing people up the
Mm.
elevator.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
So what I would say over there is really, in order for us to be successful scientists, we have to be also focused on being successful communicators. They are two sides of the same coin.
Mm.
And the scientist who can't communicate, I would say, has to brush up their communication skills, verbal,
Mm.
written, and going beyond those obvious things, empathy,
Right.
understanding as well.
Right. So interesting. I want to ask you a follow up to something you said almost in passing, and it was such a vivid description. I can see you as a young boy sitting and reading and poring over these books, and that your mother got for you. And I wonder if the reading also helped, it transported you, also if it helped even the narrative structure of reading these books, helped you start to frame your own presentations, which may have followed this sort of storytelling, more narrative, and therefore much more accessible descriptions.
I would say that is probably the most fundamental skill that I learned via my mother.
Mhm,
Because stories, especially for any child, right? Even if you kind of take a look at Mark, you're a father of two kids, I'm a father of two kids. How do we teach our children, right? Right from the time they are born, our children learn through two things: observation and narrative.
mhm,
And books bring that narrative part into play. Books also bring observational parts into play. Being able to connect observations to narrative and being able to generate observations out of narrative created, at least for me, this amazing world which I lived in my own head. And at that time, sitting in India, not knowing that I would even be in the United States, it was almost liberating and enthusiastic, just delightful to have the whole world a foot away from me.
mhm,
And what I would say to your listeners is, if there is one skill that we can teach our children and we can teach our future generations, whether it is through formal schooling or at home, it's really, let us celebrate and let us teach our children to read both fiction and non-fiction. Let us create that love of books. And when we do that, we open up their minds and we open up their hearts.
mhm, mhm. Such a great message. And in talking about books, Prashant, you have your next book is almost ready to be released. And I'd love for you to share with listeners what it's about and the process behind it.
So my next book, which I'm writing with a cast of worldwide experts in artificial intelligence, is called Demystifying AI
Mhm,
for the Enterprise. And again, keeping in with the demystifying topic, it looks at what is this thing called artificial intelligence? Why does it matter? Why should we use artificial intelligence when we've got 7 billion active human brains today? What does it do for the average company? What does it do for its employees? What does it do for their customers? And more importantly, what does it do for society? And also the understanding that what we are creating here is not Frankenstein's monster, but really something that's going to help us remove the robot out of the human and allow humans to be more humans,
mhm,
especially in the workplace. It's a book that's going to be coming out later this year, Mark, and our co-authors and I have been working on the various aspects of what makes a modern day enterprise and how AI can create new opportunities and also fix things that need to be fixed using technology to benefit the organization
mhm,
and the various stakeholders of that organization.
mhm, mhm, mhm. I want to ask you as we wrap up here, Prashant, a little bit more about the book and AI. I was introduced to this concept of, or I should say, concern about AI reinforcing racism, biases, basically just translating, from the human brain to the artificial brain, these types of very harmful racist or biased viewpoints. And I would love for you to talk about that if you have a view, how we avoid that. Are we getting a second chance maybe to get this right when it comes to decision making and leaving our biases out of them? Or is it not that simple? Is it very complicated? How are we going to go about doing this?
This is a fantastic question, Mark, and it has so many facets to it.
Mhm,
The first thing is going back to where we started this conversation, the society that we live in. America is a continuous improvement society.
Mhm.
So if there is any society on the planet that can bring these technologies to bear in as objective a fashion, I believe it is this one. We will continue to lead the world on how we do that, first thing. So from
Mhm.
a societal perspective, I'm again optimistic about what AI can do and what positive things it can bring to bear, especially given the context that you mentioned.
Mhm.
The second thing is, in the end, I think the term artificial intelligence is kind of a loaded term
Mhm.
because, in many ways, today's AI, as it exists today, works on the data we have created and uses that data to make predictions or to come to understanding of natural language and so on and so forth. So an AI itself cannot be biased because the bias comes from the implicit bias that exists in the data that we are feeding into the system. So then we have to ask ourselves, how do we reduce that bias? By making the data itself better and more useful and
Mhm.
more objective.
Mhm. Mhm.
An AI system is, well, frankly, despite all the hype, still a pretty dumb system that leverages the data that humans have created or systems that have been built by humans have created. So we have to necessarily focus on the data itself and make that data creation, collection, and management more objective in order for us to get the AI results that are correspondingly also objective.
Mhm.
And the third piece over here is, this again goes back to our previous conversation on science.
Mhm.
AI is a manifestation of science and mathematics. So a goal of AI should be to get rid, I would say, of the biases that exist to create as objective a reality as possible. And it is important for us as scientists, as engineers, and as developers to make sure that when biased data does exist, we identify it, we correct it, and we make sure that the results that come out of it go back to the purity of science,
Mhm.
which is objectivity, connected to this part we spoke about, the communication, the empathy, and the emotions and the understanding, and making that AI less biased, more useful, more objective, and frankly speaking, create conditions for the betterment of humanity.
Fantastic. Well, Prashant, this has been such an enlightening, enjoyable conversation, and hearing your perspectives from your various experiences and how you combine the beauty of science and literature and expression, and then also, of course, your ability to distill and explain in such a clear, demystified way is something that is really a gift. And thank you for sharing it with me and with our listeners.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mark. The work that you're doing in general and this podcast in particular are extremely important for us as a society and also for us to continue to keep America being the shining city on a hill. You're bringing together various perspectives that are essential and fundamental to our success as a society. And I'm absolutely delighted to have this conversation with you.
Well, thank you for that, Prashant, for your kind words. And listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of When Science Speaks. I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.